The house had been too quiet that evening. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that hums just before something breaks. The old clock above the stove ticked louder than usual, each second landing heavy in the room. I could hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the kitchen window, and the soft clink of Daniel's spoon against his glass. He hadn't said much during dinner, neither had his wife Claire. I'd learned to live inside silence since my husband passed, but this silence was different. It had a weight to it, like a shadow spreading across the table. I reached for the teapot, pouring what little was left into my cup. The smell of burnt coffee still lingered in the air. Daniel had made it too strong again. He always did that when he was nervous. Then, without looking up, he spoke. His voice was low at first, but deliberate. "Mom," he said, "you have 48 hours to move out. Claire's family owns this house now." I thought I'd misheard him. The spoon slipped from my fingers and struck the saucer with a sharp, ringing note that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. 48 hours. Move out. My house. The words floated in the air between us, too heavy to land. Claire's lips curved into something that might have passed for a smile in another life, but tonight it was victory. She didn't even look ashamed, only satisfied, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. I looked at my son. The same boy who used to run barefoot through this kitchen, who'd cried in this very room when he broke my favorite vase and swore he'd never hurt me again. He couldn't meet my eyes now. He just stared at the table, knuckles white around his glass. The clock ticked on. I didn't ask why. I didn't plead or shout. What was the point? When someone you love decides to betray you, explanations don't soften the blow, they only twist the knife. Instead, I studied the scene in front of me, trying to remember it all. The half-eaten casserole cooling in the dish. The way Claire's perfume filled the air like a foreign scent that didn't belong here. The tiny chip in the edge of Daniel's wedding ring where the gold had dulled from time. I could feel my pulse slow in my wrists, the air leaving my lungs in a long, steady breath. I'd faced storms before, real ones that shook the roof, tore the shutters off their hinges, but this felt colder, quieter, more final. My hand trembled slightly as I set my cup down. The steam had already faded, leaving only the bitter smell of tea leaves gone stale. In that moment, I remembered something my husband once said, years ago, when Daniel was still a boy. One day, he'll think he knows better than us. When that day comes, just love him quietly. The truth always finds its way back home. But as I looked at my son, at the man who couldn't meet his mother's gaze, love didn't feel like enough anymore. Claire reached for his arm, her manicured fingers resting there like a claim. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. The silence between us was louder than shouting. My house. My husband's hands had built it, my sweat had paid for it, and my memories had filled every corner. Yet somehow they sat there, across from me, telling me it no longer belonged to me. I swallowed hard and forced a small nod, pretending to accept it. The words that came out barely sounded like my own. I see. It was all I could manage. But inside, something ancient and steady woke up. Not rage, not grief, but resolve. I didn't know how yet, but I knew this wasn't the end of my story. Before I tell you what happened next, if you believe no mother should ever be treated this way, take a second to subscribe. You'll find many stories here that remind us what family truly means. The kind of stories that prove love should never come with conditions. That night, after the table had cleared and the house fell silent again, I sat alone in the dark. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and the echo of my son's words circled in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. 48 hours. That was all they thought I needed to disappear. They had no idea what those 48 hours would bring. When Daniel was born, the doctor said he had his father's eyes, calm, steady, and full of light. I remember holding him in that hospital bed, my hair damp with sweat, thinking there couldn't possibly be a greater purpose than this small life in my arms. I was 25 then, young and sure that love alone could build a future. We bought this house 2 years later. A tired little place on the edge of town with peeling paint and a leaky roof. My husband, George, had laughed when he saw it. She's ugly now, he'd said, but give her a little love, Izzy, and she'll shine. And she did. We worked side by side after long shifts. Him at the mill, me at the diner, painting walls, sanding floors, patching leaks. Daniel learned to walk on these floors, learned to read by the window where the afternoon light fell across his hair. Every nail in this house had a story. When George died, a heart attack, sudden and unfair, Daniel was only 12. I remember the way he stood at the funeral, his small hand gripping mine, his lips pressed tight like he was trying to be brave for me. He didn't cry until we got home. That night, I found him sitting on the porch steps, whispering into the air. "Who's going to take care of us now?" "Me," I said. "I am." From that day forward, I kept that promise with everything I had. I took double shifts. I washed strangers' clothes at the laundromat during the day and carried trays at night. My hands cracked from bleach and dishwater, but Daniel never saw me flinch. He needed strength, not worry. The mortgage payment waited like a hungry mouth every month, but somehow, I always found a way to feed it. When I couldn't afford Christmas presents, I baked cookies and wrapped them like treasures. When his shoes tore at the seams, I stitched them by lamplight. Every ache, every sleepless night, every bill I stretched just far enough. It was all love, sewn into survival. For a long time, I thought that was enough. Daniel grew tall, strong, handsome. People said he had a good head on his shoulders, polite, hardworking, respectful. When he graduated college, I thought maybe all those nights crying into the sink had been worth it. He hugged me tight that day and whispered, "You did it, Mom. You kept your promise." But something started to change after he met Claire. She came from money, the kind that never needed coupons or secondhand coats. She was beautiful, I'll admit that. Polished, confident. The kind of woman who made everyone else in the room feel small without saying a word. When Daniel brought her home the first time, I greeted her with pie and open arms. She smiled, thanked me sweetly, and spent the rest of the evening looking around the house like she was calculating its value. From then on, small things began to shift. Daniel stopped calling as often. When I offered advice, he'd smile politely and change the subject. He started dressing differently, speaking differently, carrying himself with the kind of hesitation that comes from living under someone else's approval. Still, I didn't question it. Love can make us blind in the most convenient ways. When they married, I gave them everything I could. A check I couldn't afford, my husband's cufflinks, the good china we'd saved for Daniel's wedding day. I remember Claire's mother thanking me in that sharp, distant way people do when they want to sound kind but can't quite hide their disdain. She called the house quaint. After the wedding, they moved into the guest room upstairs while they got on their feet. I thought it would be for a few months, a year at most, but months became years, and I began to feel like a visitor in my own home. Claire had ideas about redecorating, remodeling, rearranging. She started with the curtains, then the furniture. I told myself it was harmless. "It's only fabric, Izzy," I'd whisper, sweeping up her discarded paint chips. "Don't make trouble." But little by little, the house stopped feeling like mine. The floral wallpaper George had chosen gone. His old workbench in the shed, replaced. Even the photos in the hallway shifted. Claire moved them around to create symmetry. I'd catch Daniel watching me sometimes, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. I told myself he was just busy, just adjusting. That's what mothers do. We find reasons to forgive our children long before they ask for it. Then came the day Claire's father offered Daniel a job in his company. It was supposed to be a blessing, but I saw the strings attached. The family's influence grew heavier, their presence thicker. They began spending weekends here, speaking about the house as though it were already theirs, discussing renovations, expansion, market value. I laughed it off at first, but deep down, something cold settled in my stomach. When I mentioned the house's sentimental value one evening, Claire's mother smiled and said, "Of course, dear. But sentiment doesn't pay taxes." That was the first time I truly understood. They didn't see me as family, they saw me as an obstacle. Daniel's visits grew shorter. He started using words like practical and long-term planning. When I'd bring up George, he'd change the subject. I noticed how he deferred to Claire in everything, how his shoulders tensed when she frowned. I tried to remind myself that he was still my son, still the boy who once fell asleep on my chest after thunderstorms. But that boy was fading. And then came that night. The silence, the burnt coffee, the words that shattered what was left of my heart. Mom, you have 48 hours to move out. Claire's family owns this house now. I've replayed that sentence so many times it feels carved into my bones. But the pain isn't just from the betrayal. It's from knowing how much I gave to make him the man who could say it. Everything in this house carries the story of sacrifice. The floorboards that creak under my feet. I scrubbed them until my hands bled. The roof above his head. I patched it in the rain the year after George died. The warmth of this home. It came from years of love I refused to let the world take away. And yet, with one sentence, my son handed it to strangers. I sat awake that entire night, the ticking clock echoing like judgment. I thought about the promises I'd made, to my husband, to my son, to this home, and wondered which one I had failed. But as dawn crept through the curtains, something inside me steadied. I wasn't done. I had survived worse storms, buried deeper pain, and clawed my way back from the kind of grief that leaves most people hollow. They thought I'd surrender quietly. They forgot who taught Daniel how to fight in the first place. The morning after Daniel's ultimatum, I woke to a strange quiet, the kind that follows a thunderstorm but promises another one soon. The sunlight coming through the curtains felt wrong. Too bright for a day, when everything had already fallen apart. I moved through the house as if it were made of glass, careful not to touch anything that might remind me of what I stood to lose. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee. The chair where Daniel sat was still slightly pulled out, and for a moment, I caught myself wanting to set his cup back in its place, the way I did when he was a boy. But that boy was gone. I could hear Claire's laughter upstairs. A bright, sharp sound that didn't belong here. They were talking about travel plans, new beginnings, fresh energy. Every word felt like a nail sealing my fate. At noon, I heard a car in the driveway. Claire's parents had arrived. They didn't knock. They just walked in as though the house already had their name on the deed. Her father, Mr. Harlan, wore that smug kind of smile you see on men who mistake arrogance for confidence. Isolde, he greeted me, stretching out my name as though tasting it. Daniel told us everything. It'll all be smoother this way. We'll handle the legal side. Legal side. That was the moment I knew this wasn't impulsive. It was planned. I nodded slowly, pretending to understand. My hands tightened around the dish towel I was holding. Claire stood behind him, her eyes bright, her voice soft and rehearsed. It's better for everyone, Mom. You can find something smaller, easier to manage. We'll take care of all the paperwork. The word Mom dripped from her lips like poison wrapped in honey. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the window, staring out at the garden George and I had planted the year we moved in. The autumn leaves had begun to fall, scattering gold across the soil. I thought about all the seasons this house had seen. The laughter, the storms, the quiet dinners. Could memories be evicted too? That evening, I overheard their voices in the study. I hadn't meant to listen. I was passing by with laundry, but the words froze me mid-step. Claire's voice. Once it's sold, the debts are gone. My father said the buyer's ready. We just need her out by Friday. Daniel's reply came slower, quieter. She's still here. She'll leave, Claire said sharply. You gave her a deadline. She won't fight it. She's too proud. I leaned against the hallway wall, my knees trembling. Every word sank like a stone in my stomach. So that was it. They wanted to sell the house. It wasn't about family or space or comfort. It was about money. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, the cool wood of the wall against my back, my heart beating in uneven bursts. They thought I wouldn't fight. Maybe once they would have been right. When George died, I'd accepted every hardship without complaint. When Daniel grew distant, I told myself it was just part of growing up. But this theft wrapped in betrayal, stirred something I hadn't felt in years. I spent that night at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and old receipts, trying to piece together what I had left. My hands shook as I opened the drawer where George used to keep his papers. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. And for a moment, I swore I could still hear his voice, calm, steady, unbothered by chaos. Izzy, he used to say, never let anyone make you feel like you're standing on borrowed ground. Borrowed ground. That's exactly what Claire's family wanted me to believe this house had become. The next morning, I saw the first real crack in their confidence. Mr. Harlan came by again, this time with a folder tucked under his arm. He asked me to sign transition documents. His tone was sweet enough, but his eyes were impatient. I didn't even open the folder. I just smiled and said, "Leave them on the counter. I'll look later." He hesitated. "We'd appreciate it if you didn't delay. Timing is crucial." I met his gaze for the first time. So is honesty. He blinked, unsure whether to laugh or be offended. He chose laughter, that thin kind that covers unease. "Of course. Just practical matters, dear." When he left, I didn't touch the papers. I placed them in a drawer instead, right next to the letter George wrote me on our 10th anniversary, the one that ended with "This home will always be yours." That afternoon, the neighbors noticed the tension. Mrs. Callahan waved from her garden across the fence, her smile fading when she saw my face. "Everything all right, Izzy?" she asked softly. I lied. "Just tired." She studied me for a moment longer, the way old friends do when they already know the truth, then nodded slowly. "If you need anything at all, you know where I am." When she walked away, the tears finally came. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that soaked through without sound. Later that evening, I found Daniel in the living room. He was sitting alone, staring at his phone. I sat across from him, the space between us heavy with everything unspoken. "Do you really think this is right?" I asked. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mom, it's complicated. Claire's parents helped us with." "With what?" I interrupted. "Taking what isn't yours." He flinched but didn't look up. "It's just, the house isn't practical anymore. You don't need this much space. We can find you something smaller." I laughed, a sound sharper than I intended. "You mean something invisible?" He frowned. "That's not fair." "Neither is betrayal." He stood abruptly, muttering something about stress and misunderstanding, then left the room before I could say another word. The front door closed with a thud that rattled the picture frames on the wall. I sat there in the quiet afterward, the tick of the clock once again too loud. That night, I opened George's old journal. The one he used for repairs, sketches, notes about the house. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the edges. I flipped through until one page caught my eye. In the margin, beside a rough sketch of the floor plan, George had written, "Deed and insurance in safety box, attic, under rafters." My breath caught. A safety box? I'd lived in this house for decades and never known about it. My fingers tingled with a sudden rush of hope and fear. But I couldn't go looking yet. They'd hear me. So I waited. The next day, I acted normal. I made breakfast, smiled politely, even asked Claire how her parents were. She looked surprised, maybe even a little suspicious, but she didn't question it. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I climbed the narrow attic stairs with a flashlight and a heart that wouldn't slow down. The air up there was thick with dust and memory. Boxes, old furniture, the faint scent of cedar. And somewhere, hidden among it all, an answer. I searched quietly, every creak of the floor sounding louder than thunder. When my hand brushed against something metallic beneath a stack of old newspapers, I froze. A small, rusted lockbox sat wedged between the beams. My name wasn't on it, but George's initials were. I pulled it out, my breath trembling in my chest. The lock was stiff, but years of living with George had taught me all his hiding spots. I knew exactly where to find the key. Downstairs, taped beneath the bottom drawer of his old workbench. I didn't open the box that night. Not yet. I needed to be sure of what I was holding, and what it might change. So I sat on the edge of my bed, the box resting in my lap, and watched the moonlight crawl across the floor. For the first time since Daniel's words, I felt something steady inside me. Not fear, not anger, but purpose. They thought they'd written my ending. They had no idea the story was just turning a page. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was still. Even the birds outside hadn't begun their song. I sat up in bed, staring at the small lockbox on my dresser. Its surface caught a sliver of early light, glinting faintly, as though it were waiting for me to be brave enough to open it. My fingers hesitated on the lid. After all these years, after all that loss, I wasn't sure what frightened me more, finding nothing inside or finding something that would change everything. But George had never hidden anything without reason. I went to the workbench in the garage, my heart thudding in my chest. The key was still where I remembered, taped beneath the drawer, just as he'd written in his notes all those years ago. My hands trembled as I peeled it free, rusted slightly but intact. The key slid into the lock with a soft, reluctant click. When the lid lifted, the smell of time escaped, paper, metal, and faint traces of tobacco. Inside lay a small stack of documents, tied together with a faded ribbon. Beneath them, an envelope. My name written across it in George's unmistakable handwriting. My knees gave way, and I sank into the old chair by the bench. For a long moment, I couldn't move. Then I unfolded the papers with trembling fingers. The first sheet was the deed to the house. My name alone filled the line where ownership was declared. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear, permanent. No transfer. No mention of Daniel or Claire. No signature other than George's and mine. The second paper was a life insurance receipt, modest but real. The third was the mortgage statement marked, paid in full. I stared at them, hardly breathing. They thought the house was theirs. They thought I'd left the paperwork undone. But George had finished everything before he died. Quietly, carefully, as if he'd known I would one day need this proof to stand alone. Finally, I picked up the envelope. My name looked almost alive in his handwriting, firm, unshaken, as if he'd written it yesterday. I opened it carefully. Izzy, it began. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to remind you what you already know. This house is yours. I made sure of that. Don't ever let anyone, not even our son, tell you otherwise. Love him, forgive him, but don't surrender what we built together. It belongs to the one who held it together when I no longer could. My throat closed. The words blurred, but I didn't cry. Not yet. I read it again and again until the paper shook in my hands, until George's voice felt close enough to touch. When I finally looked up, the light through the small window had turned golden. The kind of light that makes everything seem clear, even pain. That evening, I called the only person I trusted to make sense of it, my old friend Margaret, who used to work as a paralegal at a small law office downtown. She was sharp, discreet, and unflinchingly loyal. When she answered, her voice was warm but cautious. Izzy, it's been ages. Everything all right? I hesitated, then said, not really. I found something, and I need you to look at it. An hour later, she was sitting in my kitchen with her reading glasses perched on her nose, flipping through the papers with methodical care. She didn't speak until she reached the end. Finally, she looked up. Izzy, this is solid. The deed, the payments, the insurance, it's all legal. They can't touch this house. Not without your consent. The words sank deep, slow and sure. Are you certain? I whispered. As certain as the ink on these pages, she said. If they've told people they own this property, they're lying. And if they try to sell it, they'll face consequences. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for days. For the first time since Daniel's cruel announcement, I felt my spine straighten, my pulse steady. Margaret touched my hand. You don't need to confront them yet. Let them think you're beaten. Sometimes silence buys you power. I nodded. I'd lived my whole life learning the language of quiet strength. I could speak it fluently. That night, I packed the documents back into the box, wrapped it in a scarf, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of my wardrobe. But I also made copies, 3 of them, sealed and labeled. One I hid in the kitchen pantry behind the flour tin. Another, under the floorboard beneath my bed. The third I gave to Margaret for safekeeping. It wasn't paranoia. It was protection. Days passed, and I played my role perfectly. I smiled when Claire entered the kitchen, nodded politely at Daniel's small talk, and pretended not to notice when they whispered in corners. Inside, though, I was no longer the woman they believed they'd defeated. I was waiting, patient, calculating, deliberate. Each night after they went to bed, I made my quiet preparations. I documented every item I had purchased with my own money: furniture, appliances, dishes, anything that could be separated from the house itself. Receipts, bank slips, old check stubs. Proof of what was mine. Every scrap of paper was a weapon, not of vengeance but of truth. Claire must have sensed the shift. One morning, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, eyes sharp. "You've been up early lately," she said lightly. "Planning your move?" I smiled faintly. "Something like that." She tilted her head. "You know, Daniel feels terrible about how things happened. But you must understand. We're doing this for your comfort. You shouldn't have to worry about upkeep or property taxes at your age." I looked at her, holding her gaze longer than I ever had before. "You're right," I said softly. "I won't have to worry about those at all." For a moment, confusion flickered across her face, but she didn't press further. She thought she'd already won. That afternoon, Daniel came home late. He looked tired, uneasy, like a man who knew he'd built his future on sand. When our eyes met, he tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "Mom," he said, "I hope you're packing. Claire's parents are trying to close the sale quickly. You'll have plenty left over once it's done. Enough for a nice apartment, maybe near the lake." I folded the dish towel in my hands, keeping my voice steady. "I won't be needing an apartment." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "You'll see," I said. He stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "You're making this harder than it has to be." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need defending. They only need time to reveal themselves. That night, as I stood by the window watching the last light fade, I felt George's presence stronger than ever. It was as though he was standing beside me, looking out at the same stars, whispering the same calm reassurance he always did. "Hold steady, Izzy. Let them show their hand first." The next few days were quiet, too quiet. I moved about my routines deliberately, never rushing, never reacting. The house began to feel like a stage waiting for its final act. Every time Daniel or Claire walked past me, I could see the tension tightening in their movements, the restless glances, the whispered phone calls. I didn't interrupt. I just waited. Because now the game had changed. They thought they'd pushed me into a corner. What they didn't know was that I'd just found the door that led out. And when I walked through it, I wouldn't be leaving, they would. The morning of the 48th hour came cold and bright. Frost glazed the garden, turning the dying roses into glass. I woke before dawn, calm and certain. The storm inside me had settled into something sharper, resolve. Downstairs, the movers I'd quietly hired the day before were already at work. Tom, the foreman, was a kind man from the local parish. I told him only that I needed things moved discreetly. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and handled every box with care. By the time the sun climbed over the rooftops, most of my belongings were already loaded onto the truck. The furniture, the dishes, even the framed photographs of George and me that once lined the hallway. Every piece that bore my memory went with me. What was left behind was only wood, paint, and emptiness. I stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, listening to the echo of the house. It no longer felt like mine, not because they had taken it, but because I had already decided to let it go on my terms. When the movers finished, I thanked them, pressed a folded envelope into Tom's hand, and watched the truck disappear down the road. The driveway looked hollow without it, but there was peace in that emptiness. I didn't go far. I stayed with Margaret, my friend, for the night. We sat at her kitchen table, the deed and George's letter between us. She poured tea, her hands steady. "They'll come tomorrow," she said. "Let them think they've won. And then you show them." I nodded. I didn't need revenge. I needed truth. The next afternoon, I returned to the house just before they arrived. I opened the front door slowly, taking in the hollow quiet of the rooms. Sunlight streamed through the bare windows, falling across the empty floorboards. No photographs. No curtains. No warmth. Only truth, raw and unadorned. Then I heard it. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Voices. Laughter. They came in a small parade, Claire and Daniel in front, her parents right behind, dressed in their polished coats and expensive smiles. They walked up the steps like victors returning from war. When Daniel unlocked the front door, he held it open for them, proud and dutiful. The door swung wide, revealing the barren interior. At first, no one spoke. Claire's mother blinked, her perfect smile faltering. "Where's the furniture?" Claire's eyes darted across the room. What happened here?" Daniel turned to me, confusion flashing across his face. "Mom, where's all your stuff?" "Mine?" I said softly. "Safe. Everything that was mine went with me." Claire's father frowned, stepping inside. "You can't just strip the place. Those items are part of the property." I took a small step forward, calm and measured. "No, Mr. Harlan. The deed says otherwise." I opened my bag and pulled out the folder Margaret had prepared. Neat, labeled undeniable. I handed it to him. "This house and everything in it belongs solely to me. It always has. And it always will." He flipped through the documents, his confident posture shrinking with each page. Claire leaned over his shoulder, her expression tightening. This can't be right," she stammered. "Daniel said." Daniel was misinformed. I interrupted, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "The house was paid off years ago. The deed was never transferred. My husband made sure of that before he passed." Daniel's face had gone pale. "Mama, I didn't know." "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "You didn't want to know." Silence filled the room, thick and unforgiving. Claire's mother recovered first. "We'll contest this. There must be some oversight." "You can try," came Margaret's voice from the doorway. She stepped inside, cane in hand, her presence steady as a stone wall. "But you'll lose. The documents are legal, notarized, and verified by the county office. Any attempt to sell this property would qualify as fraud." The color drained from Mr. Harlan's face. "Fraud?" "Yes," Margaret said. "A crime, if you're unfamiliar with the term." Claire looked at Daniel then, not with affection but with disgust. The kind of look people give when they realize the tool they used has broken. I could have spoken then, could have shouted, cried, demanded apologies, but I didn't. I simply folded my hands in front of me and said, "I think it's time you all left my home." No one moved at first. Then Claire turned abruptly, brushing past Daniel. Her parents followed, their indignation trailing behind them like perfume. Daniel lingered by the door, his shoulders hunched, his voice barely a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I studied him quietly. The boy who once brought me wildflowers now stood before me, hollowed by shame. "Intentions don't heal wounds, Daniel," I said softly. "Actions do." He lowered his eyes and walked out without another word. When the door closed behind them, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was clean. Margaret placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Izzy." "Not quite," I said. "It's only over when I decide what comes next." In the days that followed, word spread quickly. Burlington wasn't a large town, and secrets traveled fast when wrapped in scandal. The story of Daniel and Claire, the house, the betrayal, became everyone's whispered conversation at the market, the diner, the church steps. Mrs. Callahan stopped me one morning at the bakery, her voice hushed but fierce. "You showed them, Izzy. You did what every mother wishes she could. You stood up for yourself." I smiled, though it wasn't pride I felt. It was peace. Claire's family faded from the neighborhood after that. Their grand plans collapsed, their debts uncovered, their names spoken more in pity than respect. Daniel lost his position at his father-in-law's firm soon after. Apparently, loyalty was only valuable when convenient. He came by once weeks later, asking to talk. I didn't let him in, but I listened from the porch. He said he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, that he didn't know how to fix them. I told him quietly, "You can't fix what you broke by pretending it never happened. You can only start again." Then I closed the door not in anger, but in finality. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I looked around at the bare walls and empty rooms. For the first time in a long while they didn't feel lonely, they felt honest. Everything left was mine, and mine alone. Winter melted into spring before I truly felt the weight lift. The house, once filled with tension and ghosts, grew quiet in a gentler way. Sunlight returned to the windows. The air smelled of earth and beginnings. One morning, I stood in the garden where George and I had planted roses decades ago. The soil was still rich, though the stems had grown wild. I knelt to prune them, and for the first time in months, I felt something soft open in my chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was the beginning of peace. I thought often of what Margaret had said after the confrontation. "You've won back more than a house, Izzy. You've won back yourself. She was right. The papers and deeds were proof of ownership, but the real victory was remembering who I was before grief and guilt made me small. Still, the house carried too many echoes. Every creak in the floor, every flicker of shadow brought back voices I no longer wanted to hear. I realized that holding on to it, even with justice on my side, meant keeping one foot in the past. So I made a decision, one that surprised even me. I sold the house, not to Claire's family, not to anyone who'd profit from my pain, but to a young couple who reminded me of what George and I once were: hopeful, eager, willing to build something from scratch. When I handed them the keys, I told them, "Take care of her. She's weathered storms before, but she shines for those who love her." Then I packed what was left of my life into 3 boxes and moved into a small cottage near Lake Champlain. Just 2 bedrooms, a white fence, and a porch that looked out onto the water. It wasn't grand, but it felt right. Quiet, clean mine. Each morning, I walked along the shore, the waves whispering against the rocks like a song only I could hear. I planted new roses outside, red and white, and watched them take root. Sometimes Mrs. Callahan would visit, carrying a basket of scones, and we'd sit together drinking tea as the breeze danced through the curtains. There was laughter again. Not the loud, busy kind, but the steady hum of a life rebuilt. Daniel came by once, months later. I saw him walking up the path, slower, older somehow. His eyes carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. He stopped at the gate and took off his hat. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to see you." For a long moment I said nothing. I studied him, the man he'd become, and the boy I'd once loved so fiercely. "I was never your burden, Daniel," I said finally. "You are mine, and I've set it down." Tears filled his eyes, but I didn't cross the distance between us. Some things are forgiven in silence. He nodded, whispered a thank you I could barely hear, and turned back down the path. I watched him go, and for the first time, I didn't ache. I simply wished him peace. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the lake, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea warming my palms. The sky blazed orange and gold, the kind of color that reminds you everything ends, and everything begins again. I thought about all the versions of myself that had lived inside that old house. The young wife, the widow, the mother, the woman betrayed, and how each one had carried me to this quiet moment. If George could see me now, I think he'd smile. He'd tell me the same thing he used to whisper on hard days. "You did good, Izzy. You stood your ground." I smiled at the water, the reflection of the setting sun rippling like liquid fire. Love, I've learned, should build homes, not burn them. And sometimes, walking away isn't loss. It's the first step toward freedom. So if my story reminded you that strength doesn't always roar, that sometimes it's found in quiet persistence, in patience, in dignity, then I invite you to stay a while. Subscribe if you believe in stories that honor love, justice, and the courage it takes to stand alone. Because somewhere out there, another woman is sitting at her kitchen table, wondering if she's strong enough to fight back. And maybe, just maybe, she needs to hear that she already is.